Hello, good morning. Today y'all are going to be doing your notes on matter and energy in the ecosystem. Prior to this, you have done information on kind of just a background of what environmental science is and a review of the scientific method. So now we're going to start into some content. The information we're going to be getting in this chapter, chapter 4, should be review. We're going to be talking about the roles of living things, how the ecosystem is set up, how energy moves in the ecosystem, and then we're going to talk about different cycles of matter. All right. So first up, all right, energy in the ecosystem is everywhere. Energy originates from outer space, and here's the Crab Nebula, which is showing the birth of new stars, which are the base of all of our energy on Earth. All right. So organisms have jobs, right? And their jobs are their roles in their environment. And each organism plays a very specific role in how energy moves through the ecosystem. They also play a very unique role in how matter is cycled through the ecosystem. For example, plants get their energy from the sunlight. Plants are then eaten by some animals who then get their energy from those plants. Then those animals that ate the plants get eaten by other animals. And then when plants and animals die, they get eaten by other organisms that use them to get their energy. So, in other words, all organisms need energy to survive. And the base of all this energy is going to be sunlight. Okay. So, we have three main roles or jobs that organisms are going to have. And the way that they get their food, complete their role in their ecosystems is going to be one of three things. They're either going to be a produce their food, they're either going to consume their food, or they're going to decompose their food. Every organism, except for the ones that produce, get their energy from producers in one shape, form, or fashion. Even the lion gets its energy from a producer all the way at the very bottom, okay? So, producers are going to be the first ones we look at. And hopefully you remember producers are plants, PP, producers, plants. These organisms are going to make their own food. They're not going to need to rely on other organisms to get food from. All right. They get their energy from the sun and they use a process called photosynthesis to make their food. They are also the organisms on Earth that tend to scrub carbon dioxide and turn it into oxygen. So they are some of the bigger oxygen producers on the planet. Plants are what we call primary producers in terrestrial biomes, while bacteria are the primary producers in aquatic biomes. So we have two different types of biomes that we're going to be talking about a little bit later. Terrestrial meaning land-based and aquatic meaning water-based. So plants, those would be grasses, ferns, trees, things along those lines. They are going to be the primary producers. So they're going to be the first level. They're going to be producers on land. Bacteria, on the other hand, are the most common producers in aquatic biomes. Now, we also call producers autotrophs because that means that they make their own food. Auto means own, and troughs means the consumers that make it, okay, or the organisms that make it. So they make their own food. So here are two pictures of the autotrophs. On the left side, you see the terrestrial biome. Notice how varied we have. And on the right side, you see a small bacterial organism that is an autotroph in aquatic biomes. So immediately you can see a big difference. Terrestrial biomes, they are very apparent, very obvious. You can see them. In aquatic biomes, you might need a magnifying glass to identify some of the most common producers or autotrophs. All right, next up are consumers. So consumers are going to be organisms that cannot make their own food. In other words, we call them heterotrophs, meaning they have to get their food from other organisms. All animals are consumers, and we get energy by eating other organisms, whether that is plants or animals. We have four types of consumers. We have herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, and scavengers. So first up, we're going to talk about the good old herbivore. These are ones that only eat the producers. So in terrestrial biomes, that would be like cows and buffalo. In an aquatic biome, that would be maybe krill or some other small fish. that are going to be eating the primary producers in their respective environments. Now, one unique thing about terrestrial, so land based herbivores, is they usually have very distinct teeth. If you look at their teeth, like in these pictures, you're going to notice that, hey, like with the horse, it has like scissor teeth, which are designed to help them break the stalks of the grass. And then if you look, they have very flat back molars. If you feel it in your mouth, your back molars, they're designed to grind the food up. So right here, we can see that these animals are specifically designed to eat grass and other plants. Now, the second one we're going to talk about are carnivores. These ones capture and eat herbivores or other carnivores. Because they eat primary consumers, so herbivores are heterotrophs. They are called primary consumers because they are the first level of consumer. Anything that eats a primary consumer, so anything that eats an herbivore or the one that eats the plant, is considered to be a secondary consumer. Any consumer that eats the secondary consumer is considered to be a tertiary consumer. Tertiary is a fancy way of saying third level. So if we look right here on these images, we have the lions that are eating the buffalo that they captured. So the buffalo was the primary consumer, the herbivore. The lions are the carnivores that eat the buffalo, so they are the secondary consumer. If for some unknown reason the lions decide to go swim in the ocean, and the shark, the great white shark pictured there, decides to eat the lion, the shark would then be a tertiary consumer or the third level consumer. So yeah, that is how carnivores work. Okay. Omnivores are a third type of consumer, and they're a unique situation. They eat both producers and consumers. So there are situations where omnivores in a food web or a food chain could be a primary consumer, where they are the ones that are eating the plants, or they could be a secondary, tertiary, all the way up consumer. Okay. Humans are a prime example of omnivores. We are designed to eat both meat and vegetables, meats and plants. If you feel through your mouth and you feel your teeth, you're going to find that we have our sharp incisors, our canines, and then we have flat grinding teeth. So our dentition, our teeth are designed to help us eat both meat and plants. As we rely heavily on cooked meat, our teeth are not having to be as sharp as if we were, say, in the wild, like the bear you see pictured there, where they have the sharp canines to puncture the food that they need to puncture and rip apart, and then they have the grinding teeth for the plants that they eat. Now, the last type of consumer are scavengers. These are very crucial organisms in our environment. Think of them as the garbage men of the ecosystem. What they do is they feed on the bodies of dead organisms. They don't care if it's an herbivore, a carnivore, an omnivore, they eat it, even their fellow scavengers. Vultures and hyenas are examples of scavengers. And one fun, awesome fact is that it is illegal to kill a scavenger. So we've talked about producers and consumers. Producers are also known as primary producers, where they are plants on terrestrial or land-based environments, or they're bacteria in aquatic or water-based environments. We've talked about the few different types of consumers, where we have our herbivore, which eat plants, our carnivore, which eats other animals, our omnivore, which eats plants and animals, and then our scavengers that only eats dead things, and they are called heterotrophs. We're now going to talk about the third role that an organism can get its energy from, and those are our decomposers. So, decomposers are defined as bacteria and fungi that consume the bodies of dead organisms and other organic waste. In other words, they do plants, animals, scavengers, they do poop, they do bones, they do anything. All right, they break that down. So, for example, dead leaves. All right, they will help break them down. That's what gives it that earthy smell if you ever walk through the woods. They are very critical to an ecosystem because they recycle nutrients from organisms back into the ecosystem and they complete the cycle of matter. In other words, if we did not have decomposers, all the leaves that have ever existed on Earth would be all the way up and probably to the stratosphere, if not mesosphere. There would be no ability for life to exist. So decomposers are extremely important because they help get rid of essentially the trash that lays around that's organic. Okay. Here's some decomposers. We have a grub over here. Most of us do not like seeing them in our gardens because that usually means they're eating our root systems. We also have mushrooms. Mushrooms are very interesting organisms because mushrooms can be very harmless, and we use the harmless ones in our food, and then they can be very toxic and deadly, which we try to avoid. So decomposers have very big roles, and they have very different appearances. So we've talked about the three roles in which organisms get energy. Now, how do we show this transferring of energy in our ecosystem? Well, before we can draw anything fancy, we need to understand that they are in what we call trophic levels. All right, so as you can see on this diagram, trophic levels describe where, in relationship to others, organisms are located. So kind of think about food chains. Think back to when you did food chains. And like we always start off with the producers and then we go to the consumers. So let's look over here at our two examples of trophic levels. So our first level are going to be our primary producers. These are going to be the plants or the bacteria. So I'm going to be focusing here on the left-hand side. So we have this plant, this wonderful little flower. It is our producer in this situation. Well, this flower is fed upon by this grasshopper. This grasshopper is what we call a primary consumer. They would be our herbivore. And then the grasshopper gets caught and eaten by a field mouse. So the field mouse would be a carnivore because in this situation, we don't know if the field mouse eats anything else. All we can tell from this relationship is that the field mouse eats the grasshopper. So the field mouse would be called considered what we call a secondary consumer because it is not the one that eats the plant. It's the one that eats the herbivore. Okay. Well, the field mouse gets eaten by this rattlesnake, and the rattlesnake is what we call the tertiary consumer because it is the third consumer from the plant. And then the rattlesnake gets eaten by the red-tailed hawk. That is what we call a quaternary consumer or a fourth level consumer. It is 4 consumers away from the plant or the producer. If you notice, we have multiple carnivores in this, and that is perfectly acceptable. When we get done with your information on this, y'all will be doing an activity, and I want you to pay attention to how we have the name of the organism, or well, not the name of the organism, but the name of what type of consumer or producer it is. So on this left-hand side, we were looking at what we call a terrestrial food chain. All right, remember, terrestrial is land-based. Now let's go over and look at the right side image. This is going to be an aquatic or water-based food chain, or which shows our trophic levels. So we're going to start off with what we call phytoplankton. And phytoplankton are producers. They are bacteria-like organisms. They're very small, and they get eaten by what we call zooplankton. So zooplankton, zoo meaning animal, are plankton that do not make their own food, but instead eat the ones that make their own food. They're also microscopic, but they're a little bit bigger than phytoplankton. Zooplankton is then eaten by usually small fish, which then are eaten by bigger fish, which then are eaten by even bigger fish. In this situation, our bigger fish is a killer whale, an orca, which, funny enough, is not a whale. It is the world's largest dolphin. So that is how a terrestrial and an aquatic food chain compare in terms of trophic levels. So I kept throwing around this word food chain, right? So a food chain is literally a series of different organisms that transfer food between different trophic levels. In other words, I have my producer, my plant, that gets eaten by my herbivore, which is my primary consumer, which then gets eaten by something else, which would be my secondary consumer. And it goes all the way up until it meets a decomposer. Now, a food web is going to be where I take multiple food chains that are located in one ecosystem, and I show how those food chains interconnect or cross over to show feeding relationships. So I would show that the red-tailed hawk doesn't just eat rattlesnakes. It also eats field mice. It also eats salmon. It also eats, and I would show all the things that it eats. For the flower, I would show all the organisms that eat the flower. I would show what all eats the grasshopper or what other things the grasshopper eats if it eats something else besides that particular flower. Now, food webs are very in-depth and they describe most feeding patterns. Okay, so I want you to keep that in mind. So notice this is a food chain, very basic. We have our sunlight, which gives energy to the producer, which in this situation is a grass. And I want you to pay attention to these arrows. The arrows are going to show the direction the energy is going. So the energy comes from the producer and goes to the grasshopper, which is our primary consumer. Then our grasshopper gets eaten by the snake, which the arrow goes from the grasshopper to the snake, which is our secondary consumer. Our snake is then going to be eaten by the hawk, which once again, look at that arrow. It goes from the snake to the hawk, which is our tertiary consumer. And when the hawk dies, no scavenger happens to find it in this food chain, but instead we get a fungus. So a mushroom. It happens to find the hawk. So notice the energy level, the energy arrow goes from the hawk to the fungus, and that is our decomposer. And our decomposer makes nutrients, which then it sends back to the plants. So notice in the food chain that energy comes from the sun, and that we have arrows that show the direction the energy heads. So it goes from one level to the higher level. So it goes from producer to primary consumer to secondary consumer to tertiary consumer, and then, if necessary, to a scavenger and a decomposer. Now, on the other side, this is what a food web looks like. Notice how this is a little more complex, and it's going to be a little bit harder to follow the arrows in some areas. Notice that you're going to go from one to the other, and I want to look at the Defina. So the Defina gets energy from the decayed material. It also gets energy from the algae. And I can figure this out by looking at the arrows that are pointing towards the Defina and following it back to where it gets its energy. Now, the Defina gets eaten by the damselfly. So notice that the arrow goes from the Defina to the damselfly because the Defina is giving its energy to the damselfly. And then it also gets eaten by what we call the back swimmer. So once again, the arrow goes from the Defina over to the back swimmer. This shows a lot of different feeding connections related just to this one little organism. This gets us to go, all right, if the Defina disappeared, what would happen to the ecosystem? What would happen to all the other food webs in the environment? All right. So food webs and food chains show how organisms are related by eating each other. All right. If one link, so one organism disappears, we're going to see its effects somewhere else in the food system, in the food chain or web, and it might not be very obvious. It might be a slow progression. It won't necessarily happen immediately. Now, food chains and food webs have to be diverse and stable, right? And we determine how diverse and stable it is by looking at the different links in a food web. All right. And just remember, one food web is in, let's say, the deciduous forest where we live, is not going to be the same as a food web I would find in a desert. All right. I don't have the same animals. I don't have the same plants. Now, you heard me say diversity and stability, right? So diversity means a lot of different things, right? Think about that. Diversity. That's a hot word. If I have a lot of different plants and a lot of different herbivores, I can have a lot of different carnivores. So diversity is really important for making sure that that can happen. Stability refers to how little an environment will be affected if there's change. So if I have an ecosystem that has a lot of connections, a lot of diversity, we consider it to be very stable. This means that if one animal goes away, it's not going to be greatly affected. It might have a slight change, like I might have more bunnies if I took away a hawk than, let's say, if I took away a snake and the hawk, right? So removing of one organism is not going to be as devastating. So rule of thumb, if I have a lot of variety, a high diversity, I have a high stability. Now, this means that if I have a low diversity, such as in a desert, I have lower stability. In that desert, if I take away that snake, I can completely and utterly ruin that environment. Now, we've talked about this way that energy is transferred from level to level. We've talked about how stability and diversity is important. And we're going to talk about a situation in which you can really see this. and that is something called biological magnification. So, what is biological magnification? Well, it's where the level of a pollutant, so let's just go ahead and say the amount of bleach, all right, um, found in an animal increases in the amount as I go up in trophic levels. So let's say I use bleach to kill some weeds in my garden. All right. The plants that survive are going to have a low amount of bleach in them, right? So the animal that would eat the plant would eat quite a few plants. That means it would have more bleach in its system than the plants did. Well, then that animal gets eaten by a carnivore, right? Well, the carnivore is not going to just eat one animal, it's going to eat quite a few animals. So it's going to have more bleach than, say, the herbivore did, which had more bleach than the plant did. So that is what we're talking about with a higher concentration. Now, we see this and we saw this happen with a pesticide called DDT and the nation's animal, the bald eagle. What ended up happening was the bald eagles were having issues surviving. Like their babies weren't really hatching, or if they did hatch, they were very weak, very feeble. And scientists were trying to figure out what happened. So when they looked through their environment and they didn't see like fires or anything, they said, let's look at their diet. And they realized that, hey, the bald eagle eats a lot of fish in a day. So they looked at the fish and they analyzed the fish and they said, well, the fish also have a chemical in them that the birds have, but I don't know if it's impacting the fish. Let's kind of look down. Where are the fish getting this from? Because I don't see a chemical spill anywhere. So then they realized, hey, the fish eat a lot of insects. And then they were like, oh my gosh, we've seen a ton of insects that are dead floating on the water. Why are all these insects dead? So they looked to figure out why the insects died, and they discovered that these insects were dying because they were being sprayed with DDT. DDT was sprayed on crops as well as around water sources to get rid of insects that were very annoying. And unfortunately, the small amount that was needed to kill the insects, really built up in concentration until we saw the negative effect in the bald eagle. So the bald eagle doesn't even have to be anywhere near where they were spraying the pesticide, the DDT, for it to have the impact. Now imagine if that were the people that were eating the fish and not the bird. What would that have done to the human population? So here are some images of DDT. Notice that DDT was very widely used. It was administered in such a low dose that it was considered not to be harmful for people. But that does not mean I would want to stand next into a cloud of DDT, like the people in the upper left-hand picture. So this is what biological magnification can look like. So the DDT that was found in the water was a very, very small amount, but by the time it reached the bald eagle, it had increased in concentration. So it increased in how much was present by 10 million times. So once again, we were having very sickly eaglets that were born, if they were born at all. There were a lot of eggs that the shell was so thin that as soon as the chick started getting a little too big or moving around, it would puncture the shell and then the chick would die because it wasn't ready to live. There were other times where when the mother would lay the egg was just so soft that it would crush the baby. So biological magnification, it shows how human actions can impact the transference of energy in an environment. Now, how is energy and food related to certain things? So you notice I've been using them kind of interchangeably. That's because food is our energy source. We don't plug into the wall to recharge. We eat food to recharge. Energy from the sun is what all the ecosystems are based off of. And we find this very important to remember. So energy makes the plants become autotrophs or producers. They make photosynthesis. Consumers eat the plants. In other words, the consumers get their energy from the sun through the plants. So all the energy that is ever going to exist in an animal starts with the sun and how much sun the plant can harvest. Now, the amount of energy that goes from the plant to the consumer, to the herbivore to the omnivore to the carnivore, as we go up in level, the amount of energy that is transferred is limited. All right. We call the amount of energy that is available, or the total amount of organic material that might be available, is biomass. All right. This is, in other words, the potential food or energy source for the next trophic level. When we're talking about biomass, we're talking about how much food a wolf has in its environment to eat. We're talking about how much food a rabbit has in its environment to eat. Okay. As we go up, the amount of consumers decreases because of how much more food they need from the previous level. So, not all energy gets transferred. This is really important. Most of the energy is used up by organisms just simply to live. We tend to radiate a lot of heat. So, we lose a lot of energy in the form of heat, movement, digestion, thinking, sleeping, breathing, even the act of eating itself. So the way that we show this transference of energy, rather than just using lines and arrows, is we actually do something called an ecological pyramid. So this is a diagram that shows a relative amount of energy for each trophic level. So right here, we're going to do a side-by-side comparison. All right, 100% of the energy that will ever exist in a food web is found in producers, and they are going to be the very base of the ecological pyramid. So the diagram on the left shows that they have 100% of energy. They get it all from the sun. Then if we look over on the left-hand side, you're going to see that we have plants. All right, they're above bacteria. Bacteria are kind of a tricky organism to put on there. They're just down there at the very base to show that they give the nutrients to the plants, as well as to remind you that bacteria are also producers. So now we move up to primary consumers. Remember, these are going to be our herbivores, sometimes possibly omnivores, but we're going to focus mainly on them being herbivores. Notice they only get 10% of the energy that was presented to the producers. Then the secondary consumers, which are carnivores, they only get 1% of the energy that the producers get. And then the tertiary only get 1/10 of a producer's energy. So notice how much of a drastic drop there is. It's a pretty significant drop. Okay. We have the cycle of life, which is very obvious in this. And this is a beautiful little snapshot. We have Miss Smith. She has her daughter 40 years later. Miss Smith's no longer pushing her daughter around. Instead, her daughter is now pushing her around. Okay. So if you have any questions, please reach out to me, and I hope you have a wonderful day.